Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and in today's video, I wanted to talk about the Boston Celtics. And this is a team that I've been pretty vocal over the last couple of days in talking about how I've been disappointed in some of the moves that they've made or the lack of moves that they've made this offseason, whether that be in the draft or free agency or in the trade market. And I'd say overwhelmingly over the last 2.5 to 3 years that I've been doing YouTube consistently, I have been overwhelmingly positive about the Boston Celtics, about their front office, about them as an organization. And lately, I've kind of come to the realization that that needs to be evaluated. And we really need to look at the history of roster movement or lack of roster movement over the last few years and really evaluate what's going on here in Boston and if they are potentially in trouble in terms of what their future is going to look like as an organization. So with all those things said, really quickly before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, then consider subscribing. I upload twice a day, every day, all throughout the off season, and the videos lately have been crushing it. We are very, very close to 100,000 subscribers, and you guys are helping me get there each and every day, and I really, really appreciate it. You can also leave a like rating on the video as well. Helps me out a ton, gets the video out to more people on YouTube, and you can check me out at various socials at the bottom of the screen. And with those things said, let's go ahead and talk about the Boston Celtics. So I think it's pretty clear, right? When you look at the roster itself right now, you look at the roster on paper, the Boston Celtics are going to be okay moving forward in the future in terms of the players they currently have. The Jaylen Brown, Jayson Tatum combo, as long as those guys are on the roster, they're going to be interesting. They're going to be competitive. Worst case, they're going to be a team that is going to be able to compete, for like a top 6, top 4 seed in the Eastern Conference, right? As long as those two guys are there, they continue to improve. They've got a really nice foundation there that they got as a result of that Brooklyn Nets trade back in the day when they sent KG and Paul Pierce to Brooklyn. Now, my problem here comes in with the front office itself. And again, it's odd for me to not have faith in the Celtics front office because I've been overwhelmingly positive about things that they've done, about the flexibility, about the cap space, about how they've done everything over the years. But I think over the last 2 or so years, when you really sit down and look at it, there's been plenty of questionable moves or a lack of moves. Now, let's first look at some of the big name players in the league because I think that's the most important point here to hit on as it relates to the Celtics is what do other players think about this team? What's the reputation of the Boston Celtics around the league in terms of as a free agency destination or just as an organization to play for? When Anthony Davis was trying to get out of New Orleans, he basically told the Celtics, don't bother. We're not going to go there. His father specifically mentioned the Isaiah Thomas situation, which we'll get into a little bit later. So there's Anthony Davis's position. James Harden recently was basically told the Celtics, stay away. I don't want to go there. Don't even bother trading for me. Kyrie obviously left last offseason in free agency. And now, most recently, we had Al Horford as well as Gordon Hayward. And when you look at each of those things individually, it's relatively easy to explain those things away, right? Hayward and Horford got offered tons of money on longer-term deals. That's why they left Boston. Kyrie, it just wasn't a good fit. We know that the whole situation was there. And Harden is clearly very intent on going to Brooklyn, and Anthony Davis was very intent on becoming an LA Laker. So when you look at all those things individually, you can explain it. You can say this, you can say that. But I think the most critical examples of there potentially being an issue here in Boston are Horford and Hayward. And I think when you look at all these things collectively, it points towards a direction that something could be wrong here. And then especially, as I said, with Horford and Hayward. So yes, those two guys got massive contracts to go elsewhere. Horford has already been moved because of how big his contract is. And then Gordon Hayward signed a $30 million annually contract to go to Charlotte when he, turned down a player option for $34 million for next year. So obviously a great move from a financial perspective for both of those players to turn down those player options. But I think it comes back to what we thought of those players when they were in Boston and then how they ended up leaving that situation. Because I think we both considered both of those guys, considered both of those guys to be, team first players, guys that would put the team ahead of themselves. And when they opted out, specifically Horford, a lot of Celtics fans thought, oh, that's kind of surprising, but I'm sure they'll come back. It'll be on a longer term deal. It'll just be on, less money. Maybe we'll have more cap space than we thought that we would. And that thought was kind of there for Gordon Hayward this offseason as well. But both of those guys ended up leaving, and I don't think that it's all a money thing. Obviously, Hayward wanted a bit more of a role in the offense. That's why he's going to Charlotte, and the money was huge there. And Horford, it was just a long-term financial security thing for him to be able to go to Philadelphia in what was a very odd role and then get paid a ton of money. And I'm not saying that they should have re-signed those guys to the numbers that they signed elsewhere. I just think it's interesting that those two players specifically didn't want to be in Boston anymore, to the point where they started exploring other options and ultimately accepted those options. And when you add all those things together, I think you have to start thinking about, what is it about the Celtics? What is it about the Boston Celtics that is making players either not want to be there in the first place or want to leave once they get there? And I think one common thread throughout all of this, as well as a common piece of frustration for me lately, is Danny Ainge in the front office. And I think rightfully so, this is the front office that gets a good amount of praise, right? When you're going back to the Nets trade, when you're going to the fact that they traded down from number 1 to get Jayson Tatum at 3, and they got extra assets. And then the Markelle Fultz pick ended up the way that it did, the way that they've developed Jaylen Brown. There's been a lot of good things here in Boston, right? But from a front office perspective lately, I'm starting to question, quite frankly, the competence of the front office there in Boston, as well as their methods. Because when we go back to the Isaiah Thomas trade that sent him to Cleveland, I think that was kind of a turning point for a lot of players around the league in terms of their perception of Boston, and specifically the front office that's currently in place with Danny Ainge there. Because Isaiah Thomas was a player that I've made multiple videos about this, but quite literally gave the Celtics about as much as he could have. I mean, he was playing through tragedy, it was a very painful injury in an all-NBA season, was really pushing to get that team as far as he could possibly get them in a season in which people really didn't expect them to be nearly as good as they were, and he gave that franchise as much as he could. And at the first opportunity that they could to improve their roster, to improve the organization, they flipped Isaiah Thomas in exchange for Kyrie Irving and some other assets. And it's always been kind of understood, right, that that's just the way that business is done, and that players are able to be traded whenever. And as a result, now players have started to try and take back some of the power by having a little bit more to say, a little bit more in the say of where they do or don't play. But I think the way the Isaiah Thomas situation was handled specifically did not sit well with players at all. And it's not just the fact that he was traded, because a lot of players get traded, but it's the circumstances specifically. It's what he did with that franchise, and then how quickly he was just cast aside. And I mean, we hear Anthony Davis's dad mention that specifically, but I think that there are a lot of players that hold a bit of animosity towards Boston, and that is certainly a concern. Now, in terms of the front office stuff specifically, I'm really not sure what's happening right now, because this is a team that for multiple drafts has had 2 or 3 first-round picks. They've had plenty of assets. They've been able to be movers and shakers. And to this point, it hasn't really resulted in anything outside of guys that they picked in the top 3 in Jayson, Tatum, and Jaylen Brown. Now, yes, they traded one of those picks for Kyrie. Kyrie left. But they've had plenty of picks in the teens. They've had multiple picks in multiple drafts, including this most recent draft. And I said I would be shocked if they made a selection with all 3 of those picks, and they basically did. They traded away one of the picks, the last pick they had in the first round, and that is par for the course with the way that this team has treated the quote-unquote improvement of this roster, and that they've been relatively passive about it. And I think they kind of missed their window almost to a certain extent, because for so long they were this up-and-coming, plucky team, right? Like, they had all these advantages. They could do whatever they wanted with their picks. They could be involved in every star trade. Those assets are pretty much exhausted at this point, outside of Jayson, Tatum, and Jaylen Brown, who obviously they'd like to keep on the roster. So in terms of their cap situation, in terms of what they have right now, this is going to be their group, and I'm not convinced that it's a championship level one, and it certainly could have been had there been better moves made in the front office, which gets me to my final point, which really instigated this entire video, and that's the Gordon Hayward situation. And it became pretty clear about 2 weeks ago that Gordon Hayward was heavily considering declining his $34 million player option, which was kind of out of nowhere given the salary cap space around the league being limited, given a lot of different factors. People just didn't think that Gordon Hayward was going to opt out, but apparently he was so unhappy in Boston that he did turn down that offer, or that player option, excuse me, and it turned out to be the correct decision. 4 years, $120 million is a massive overpay, and I'm not trying to make it seem like it isn't, and good for Gordon Hayward for going out and getting that money. However, there were reports that Danny Ainge had on the table an offer for a sign and trade for Gordon Hayward that involved Miles Turner and Doug McDermott. And he said no because he wanted either Oladipo or TJ Warren in addition to Miles Turner in a Gordon Hayward sign and trade. It was reported for the first few days of NBA free agency that Gordon Hayward wanted to go to Indy. He wanted to go to Indy. They were willing to sign him. They're looking at a deal at $25 million a year, which is a huge number for Gordon Hayward. Obviously not what he ended up signing for, but the focus was all on Indy. And there's no way for us to confirm if this is true or not, right? But let's just say for the sake of argument that Boston had that offer on the table, Doug McDermott and Miles Turner in exchange for a sign and trade for Gordon Hayward. If somehow Boston let that slip away from them for Hayward to go sign an outright deal with the Charlotte Hornets, I would be fuming. I would be furious if I was a Boston Celtics fan, because Hayward declining that option was one of the worst case scenarios for them this offseason as it relates to their roster next year, because there was no way for them to replace him as a player with cap space, because they were still going to be over the cap even if he declined the option. So the only way that they were going to get value back for Gordon Hayward was going to be in a sign and trade scenario. And if that scenario presented itself specifically for a player like Miles Turner that would fit super well with this roster, and they turned it down in order to get more leverage to get Oladipo Warren, and then Hayward turned around, got a bigger deal from Charlotte and decided to go there, that is a train wreck. Absolute train wreck of a general manager move by Danny Ainge in the front office. Again, there's no way to confirm that's actually what happened, but it was heavily reported for a few days, and then suddenly Gordon Hayward is in Charlotte, which makes me think that it's at least a little bit possible that that is how the whole situation went down. And if it is, I would be furious. Now, ultimately, I still think Danny Ainge is a decent GM. I think that at a certain point, though, we are overrating their front office, and quite honestly, we're overrating them as an organization. Clearly, they're not a destination. Clearly, players don't want to be there. And once they get there, even a lot of times they want to leave as well. And I think Ainge's style of general managing, if that's even a word, is at least a little bit questionable at this point. The aggression with which he shopped some of his players, for example, Kemba Walker was heavily shopped this offseason for picks, trying to get, whether it be James Harden, trying to improve the roster in any way. Danny Ainge will trade anybody at any time. He showed that with the Isaiah Thomas thing. But then oddly, on the other end of the spectrum, he's a little bit hesitant to pull the trigger at times as well. And I just think it's a bit of a mess of a situation. Now, a couple of months from now, everything could be fine. They could be trading for this player or that player, and everything would be, everything could be completely fine in Boston. But for right now, in this moment, I'm concerned that they're overrated and that there are, slightly bigger issues going on there with the Celtics, with players around the league, other than just, it's Boston, we don't want to play there. I think there could be some other things going on, and that's kind of what I want to talk about in today's video. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.